First and foremost, dear listener, we recognize how valuable your time is, and as such have done our best to limit the duration of this document, with most, if not all, of our recommendations to be highlighted with limited detail. Of course, as it relates to any sort of public legislation, municipal, provincial, or federal, details are of the utmost importance, and as such, we look forward to following up, where applicable, with greater detail in the near future. Please find our recommendations divided into applicable sections and individually itemized thereafter for ease of reading. Recommendations for public spending. An undisclosed amount to be allocated and dispersed as a one-time payment to each of the designated and recognized Canadian registered non-profit affiliates for each of the following Canadian first responder units listed in subsection 1A. An undisclosed amount to be allocated and dispersed as a one-time payment to a designated and recognized Canadian nonprofit cause or initiative affiliated with each Canadian first responder unit in lieu of the allocation and disbursement described in Section 1. An undisclosed amount to be allocated and dispersed as a one-time payment for retired first responders housing grant, with the recipient to be chosen at the discretion of the Minister for Families and Social Services. $1,250 Canadian to be allocated and dispersed as a one-time research grant to a recent graduate of or fourth-year student currently studying in Langara College's Political Science Department and or faculty. The sole purpose of this research grant is for the grant recipient to write an original research essay clarifying and highlighting why the respective parliamentary and or legislative protective services for Canada, Ontario, and British Columbia are distinct and separate from other Canadian law enforcement units. The grant recipient and completed essay/study are to be chosen by and submitted to the Office of the Canadian Federal Member of Parliament for Vancouver South. An undisclosed amount to be allocated and dispersed as a one-time payment for each of the following Canadian secondary schools, to be used at each institution's discretion. And a list of the itemized Canadian secondary schools has at this time them being undisclosed for privacy concerns. An amount as yet determined to be allocated and dispersed as a one-time payment to an as yet selected seniors housing provider, entirely separate from Kanata Media Inc., for the creation of 4 separate interfaith 25 permanent resident seniors housing facilities in each of the Canadian municipalities listed above in subsection 4.A. Contractual stipulations to be written into the agreement between the Canadian federal government and the as yet selected seniors housing provider, guaranteeing 10% of residential units in each of the 4 facilities to be reserved for LGBTQ identifying individuals. An as yet determined amount to be allocated and dispersed on an annual basis to entirely cover the operational costs of the 4 facilities and their residents. The selection criteria for permanent residents of the combined 100 seniors housing units are to be codified as follows. 5 residential units in each of the 4 facilities are to be selected on an ongoing basis at the discretion of Kanata Media Inc., a British Columbia Incorporated Company's corporate governing board. The remaining 80 residential units to be selected on an ongoing basis at the discretion of the Office of the Canadian Federal Minister for Seniors. And the itemized Canadian municipalities who are to host these facilities are as follows: Toronto, Ontario, Montreal, Quebec, Calgary, Alberta, and Vancouver, British Columbia. An undisclosed amount to be allocated and rewarded as a one-time payment to each of the following British Columbian public housing affiliates and or providers listed in subsection 5A, to be used for facility upgrades. Contractual stipulations to be written into the award clarifying, recommitting, and reinforcing protections for temporary and or permanent residents of these facilities who identify as LGBTQ. Itemized British Columbian public housing affiliates and or providers remain undisclosed at this time for privacy concerns. Limited funding at an as yet determined amount in conjunction with public policies streamlining and correcting the operational and staffing shortfalls to be allocated and dispersed to existing and or new hygiene showers provided in each of the municipalities listed in subsection 6A. Itemized Canadian municipalities are as follows: Toronto, Ontario, Ottawa, Ontario, Vancouver, BC, and Victoria, BC. Limited funding to be allocated and dispersed as a one-time payment to each of the following public transit providers for the integration of French language station signs and announcements on mass transit, subway, elevated rail, etc., and not the larger transit system, bus lines. The public transit systems to receive the aforementioned funding are listed in subsection 7A. Itemized Canadian public transit providers, the Toronto Transit Commission and TransLink of Vancouver, British Columbia. Limited funding to be allocated and dispersed as a one-time payment to each of the following public transit providers for the integration of English language station signs and announcements on the single largest bus transit line and not the larger transit system. The public transit systems to receive the aforementioned funding are listed in subsection 7A. Legislative advocacy, where applicable, for a one-time single-use provincially issued waiver allowing for the integration of the above specified English station signs and announcements, ignoring existing provincial language protection laws, where applicable, on a one-time single-use basis. Itemized Canadian public transit providers to receive this funding for English station signs and announcements are les Réseaux de Transport de la Capitale of Quebec City. $150,000 Canadian to be allocated and dispersed as a one-time payment for the creation of and continued financing of the Dennis Kader Environmental Science Academic Award, an ongoing 4-year award to be awarded to students under a criteria to be later clarified. This award is to receive continued annual funding from Kanata Media Inc., a British Columbia Incorporated Companies philanthropy fund. This additional funding is to be set at a funding level set and agreed to by Kanata Media Inc.'s corporate governing board. $1,000 Canadian to be allocated and dispersed as a one-time payment to the City of Montreal, Ville de Montréal, for the creation and installation of a plaque to be placed outside of and designating the city's mayoral executive restroom, the Dennis Kader Executive Restroom. Recommendations for public policy. The following recommendations are meant to be understood both individually and in collaboration with one another for the drafting, tabling, passing, and implementation of legislation and policies grandfathered to a reasonable date where and when applicable. They are, in no particular order, as follows. Increasing penalties for Canadian law enforcement and security services who attempt to falsify and or unlawfully manipulate evidence and or circumstances to secure criminal convictions. General amnesty for non-violent, non-narcotic, petty criminal offenses committed by Canadians prior to 2020. Investigating acts of malfeasance, public funding misappropriation, and criminal activity at the University of Ottawa's 1848 student pub. Investigating acts of malfeasance and public funding misappropriation at the University of Ottawa's student psychiatric health services and student counseling services. Investigating acts of malfeasance, public funding misappropriation, and criminal activity within Langara College's admission, finance, and registration departments, respectively. Investigating acts of criminal malfeasance, public funding misappropriation, and criminal activity at Rock Bay Landing, a public housing affiliate in Victoria, British Columbia. Mandating that the parent service provider, Kool-Aid Society of Victoria, British Columbia, divert funding to other facilities and or suitable areas of need until such time as public confidence is restored and appropriate staffing changes are made at Rock Bay Landing. Investigating acts of criminal malfeasance, public funding misappropriation, and criminal activity at Salvation Army locations throughout Vancouver, British Columbia, a public housing affiliate in Vancouver, British Columbia. Mandating that the parent service provider, Salvation Army of Vancouver, British Columbia, divert funding to other facilities and or suitable areas of need until such time as public confidence is restored and appropriate staffing changes are made at Salvation Army locations throughout Vancouver, British Columbia. Investigating acts of criminal malfeasance, funding misappropriation, and criminal activity at St. Andrew's College, a private secondary educational institution in Aurora, Ontario. Mandating that any public funding received by St. Andrew's College be diverted to other educational institutions and or suitable areas of need until such time as public confidence is restored and appropriate staffing changes are made at St. Andrew's College. Reaffirming, clarifying, or enacting financial regulations grandfathered to a reasonable date that allow for children of Canadian individuals to use their parents' personal credit card, with previously expressed verbal or written consent for the use of retail or online purchases. Recommendations for legislation and or policies that penalize municipally elected officials, grandfathered to a reasonable date, with wage garnishment and community service for criminal environmental negligence, with criminal environmental negligence undertaken by elected municipal officials in an area as yet defined by provincial and federal legislators. As Canada's upcoming 2019 federal election fast approaches, and parties and their respective candidates look for ongoing support, our digital media company, its investors, and the communities where we operate once again hope you have the time to review and, if applicable, comment on the contents of the above document. Thank you. Merci.